Behold, my glorious supporter DerpyTW has requested some discussion about this subreddit, the name of which I cannot say without my video getting censored. And I don't edit these videos, so I'm not going to bleep it out. But it's called this, HFY. And DerpyTW has a very involved question about this subreddit and its stories, which are focused on, as you might imagine from the title, kind of what makes humanity special or awesome, something that particularly depicts humanity's specialities. Specifically, DerpyTW explains in the context of kind of a sci-fi imagining, like humanity has made contact with other intelligent species with their own civilizations out there. And these stories on this subreddit, which I wasn't familiar with, but maybe some people are about humanity being exceptional in some way. DerpyTW explains that it's usually because humanity comes from a death world, according to the rest of the galaxy. I guess our world is more brutal or something, and that's why we ended up being a species that has this quality. So DerpyTW's question goes on to explain kind of the three different archetypes of humanity being awesome that people use on this HFY subreddit. And here's how I'm gonna answer this question, because it's basically about like, what do you think of them? Which way of humanity being awesome appeals to me, right? So I'm gonna read you these three types. As we go, I'm gonna say what I think about them. And then eventually I'm going to tell you what I think is a nice, unique thing about humanity in the context of like a fantasy or sci-fi setting, because I don't really like any of these three. I kind of disagree with that approach. I have some problems with that approach. And they're all very interesting, though. I just personally have my own to suggest. So that's what we're going to do. There's going to be three examples. I'll talk about them as I go. And then I have my own suggestion for what might be like a good way to explain humanity's awesomeness, if there is any, right? So here we go. So I'm going to read you each type, and then we'll talk about them as we go. So the first one, story type A, Derpy says, is humanity as jack of all trades, where we have decent strength and intelligence, solid military and economic strategy, decent military strength. However, what puts us apart is that human ability to go beyond, to do more than would ever be expected from any other galactic race. Perhaps to the point of insanity from the perspective of some races, to the point of self-destruction, maybe, whether it be for individuals, nations, or the entire species, as well as how humans have a strong ability to form groups. Cool. Yeah, so humans as jack of all trades, or like more than the sum of their parts is kind of a thing, the group mentality thing. So here's where I can immediately start talking about why I often disagree with how humans are depicted relative to other fantasy or sci-fi races. I don't think that there's anything unique about humans forming groups. I think that the way any civilization would have come about would be because they're creatures that form groups, right? It's very hard to believe that a creature that is anything appreciably like us, that we could relate to on any level, although I guess maybe that doesn't matter, would not, form groups, right? It's hard to believe that isn't just like a basic building block for a civilization. I find it challenging to imagine that other intelligent civilizations we would encounter would just mysteriously not be in groups. That just doesn't really make sense to me. I guess it's possible. Maybe they reproduce by budding, but even then, like, don't they protect their young? It's just like everything we know about life, there are so many advantages to being in a group it's just challenging to imagine that would be something even remotely unique about humanity. So that you can probably see where I'm going with this whole parlay now. For a lot of these, I kind of feel like, is that something unique about humans, or is it something unique about conscious beings broadly? I mean, we don't know for sure, but is there a good reason to think it isn't? And I think for groupthink or tribalism, the answer is no. I think there's every reason to believe that we should expect that when we meet other intelligent civilizations. Now, the jack of all trades thing, again, I kind of feel like that relative flexibility is sort of what defines, if you look at humans evolving alongside other creatures, a lot of it was that flexibility, was opposable thumbs, was, that elasticity that even makes us different from other creatures in the first place as far as like organizing ourselves. So it makes sense to assume that's a unique thing about humans. But if you think about what's happening on some other planet, and there's other life, almost certainly, and some living, eventually going to be intelligent civilization creatures are evolving there, it's very difficult not to imagine that they too would have that very advantageous trait. It's the kind of thing where the less versatile everyone else is, the more rewarding it is to be versatile yourself. In a metagame in a video game where people are very stagnant, being flexible is more powerful because a larger number of people are not ready for what you will be able to flex into. So you don't have to be as good at each individual thing to make it useful. To put it a different way, in a game with a very strong kind of rock, paper, scissors typing, being average is more powerful because if there's a big advantage to countering, fire type Pokemon or whatever, then you don't need to be a very powerful water type to still win and take advantage of that weakness. Pokemon analogy, does that work? So being a jack of all trades is inherently strong if you have the ability to apply those traits, meaning that, again, I don't really feel this is anything unique to humanity. It's interesting. Like, I like hearing about humanity as a jack of all trades. I guess the thing that I'm criticizing, or I find really interesting, is this idea that that is an interesting trait in the context of other galactic civilizations. I don't think it is. I feel like human jack of all trades ingenuity is the most interesting when there aren't other civilizations involved, because that makes us we're only unique in the context of our own planet. That's what I think. So that's my response to this one. I hope that makes sense. I hope you're enjoying where I'm going with this. Let's read type number 2, type B. This is humans as the apex of something, or perhaps nearly everything. Maybe our statecraft is just amazing. Maybe we're really good at tactical alliances. I don't know a lot of statecraft, Derpy says, neither do I. Maybe it's that we're such an economic powerhouse that no one touches us. Perhaps our military strategy and tactics are just way better, so that even with bad technology, we just easily defeat our attackers. Generally, these stories put humans in a defensive war to paint the enemies as the bad guys. And the final option, which some stories take, is that humans were living in such insanely bad conditions on Earth that we're stronger, faster, basically every way, always on alert, and can shrug off most of what the galaxy can throw at us. Again, I just feel like that's inherent to any larger intelligent civilization. That's what you would imagine they would go through. And I think here I'm seeing how this death world premise is something I kind of inherently don't agree with. I sort of feel like the world is the way it is because of the nature of becoming a larger organized civilization itself. The moment we started industrial revolutioning, we sort of locked in that we were going to develop this way, cause global warming, displace some species, give ourselves a viral pandemic, have an arms race to try to beat the pandemics, probably all die. If we didn't, we would be organized like that. And I kind of feel like that would happen to any intelligent species trying to grow a civilization. That just seems like cause and effect about the very nature of organizing and advancing on the tech tree. I don't know, of course. I'm just saying my criticism is that that doesn't seem like it has anything to do with humanity. It seems like that would just happen unless you somehow knew to avoid it. That being said, this one is where my more interesting approach, or what I think is a more interesting approach, to these kind of specialties of humanity comes in. This idea that humanity, in the context of the rest of the galactic community, has some trait that on Earth is kind of average, but on other planets, things developed in such a way that it's quite unusual to have that trait. So for example, I could imagine that, right now we live in a time period where a lot of countries, war is kind of over from a direct violence perspective. There are parts of the world where people are fighting, but a lot of countries have kind of passed the point where it can make sense anymore to physically attack each other. There's sort of a mutually assured destruction threshold and a kind of a level of global community that is reached where if people squabble, on the surface it seems like you would just destroy yourself or your reputation or something. And maybe there's a planet where that happened way faster, and so there were a lot of just wild animals early that kind of knew not to hurt each other. And so maybe that species developed to be very non-combative. They're maybe smarter than us. From our perspective, they're more specialized, they're smarter or whatever. On their planet, that is still that kind of jack of all trades level of expertise. They're relatively average at fighting for their planet, but there wasn't that much fighting there. So maybe without changing any of this, like, intelligent species would develop in this general way, we could still be more specialized at something, possibly. To put it a different way, think about where I'm going with this parlay is like elves, dwarves, humans. What are humans just in the middle? Well, maybe in the context of, elves and dwarves and whatever being around, yeah, we're not as artistically inclined. We're not as intelligent. We're not as good at building, but we happen to be tactically superior, simply because the elves and the dwarves maybe have a relatively one-note combat style. They just happen to have evolved in a way where it isn't as viable, or they just didn't do it, a lot of other combat styles. Whereas we humans had a body type that was relatively in the middle, and it made more sense to try different combat styles, making us superior at that. Here's a place where I feel like there's a technology question. Doesn't that kind of go away once you get a lot of technology? I don't know. So there's a difference between sci-fi and fantasy there for me anyway. Or maybe magic is sort of the same thing. Yeah, it kind of is. I feel like it depends how magic works, of course, but I imagine, think of D&D. If you're playing a race that is doing something physical, you're playing a class that's going to attack physically, and you're playing a very physically extreme race, dwarves with their penchant for wearing heavy armor without being impeded, Goliaths with their friggin' 8-foot tall body that can crush anything, and they're super physically tanky. It matters a lot what race you are, but if you're using magic or even just a ranged weapon, it suddenly matters a lot less what race you are. In D&D, this isn't actually entirely true because you still want those racial bonuses, but anyway, if you use the Tasha's rules for changing your racial bonuses, anyway, whatever. People who don't know about D&D don't get that. The point I'm trying to make is it kind of feels like magic or technology evens the playing field there and makes it hard to be the apex of something if it isn't just like, we developed this technology and you didn't, or this kind of spell and you didn't. But even then, I feel like that's sort of a consequence of the tech tree. I don't think that a broad understanding of physics, for example, will allow other different intelligent civilizations to develop technology that is so different from us. It's probably just universally easy to develop certain kinds of technology, and again, relatively universally hard to develop others. I doubt that the order that the tech tree is encountered or imagined changes that much depending on each civilization. So I don't know. I still feel like humans are relatively similar to each other, but I do like this approach much better because I feel like it's possible that humans can be not really unique in being like average at everything, but that average could contextually be actually quite good compared to our fellows. As just a quick example, there's some statistics logic that indicates that like if you take the average, we would expect to be larger, I think it is, than most other aliens. Like other life forms, we would expect to be smaller and more numerous, or it might be larger and less numerous, I forget. But there's something like that where because of statistics, it's likely that we are living in a simulation. There's that whole thing, but a similar thing that dictates that we can expect something about how like big we are relative to other species. So in our world, it's relatively neutral, right? There's plenty of things that are around our size on Earth, but maybe overall we happen to be a little bit unusual in that way that is on our planet average. Interesting, maybe. And now we have type number 3. This is about human psychology and endurance, a little similar to the like go even further beyond thing from type A. Derpy says in these types of stories, there's an enemy who is psionically capable. Okay, so they can read minds. However, because human, we basically can't be mind read, and sometimes humans can even develop countermeasures to mess up whoever is trying because we were born on a death world. There's that again, and our human psychology is just too much for them to handle. The endurance part is usually how humans can just like take a hit and keep on trucking. How losing an arm or a leg, as long as it can be treated quickly, isn't that big of a deal. And even if you get like nearly brain exploded by a railroad spike, you might be able to stand back up as long as it's removed properly. Sure. So the idea here is that humans are tenacious in some either kind of lucky or innate way. That first one is interesting. So it's the example that there are like mind readers, but something about humans, either to represent human tenacity or by coincidence, maybe, it just doesn't work on us. So something just happens to make us special in the galactic community. This could be something like there's a traditional MacGuffin in sci-fi and fantasy where some nation or some planet just has a mineral that happens to be rare in the universe, and so they're kind of significant for no reason other than that there just happens to be a lot of that on their planet. They may not even particularly value it, or maybe they do. Maybe it's inherently powerful and that's why they're noteworthy. It's kind of a chicken before the egg thing. Or maybe to them it's sort of whatever, but to other species, it could turn out that bombardier beetle, flaming butt fire, look up bombardier beetles, is like a healing salve to like most other intelligent species, but it's just not useful to us. And so we don't think we have anything special, but we do, Or again, human thought process maybe works some different way. Maybe many other intelligent species developed a kind of group telepathy ability that makes them very vulnerable to mind reading, but we didn't. And that actually happens to be common, but we just coincidentally didn't do it. Who knows? Obviously I don't mean to be pretending like I know everything about what every other civilization will be like. I'm just kind of questioning whether that would be a difference. But I can totally see this. There might be something where we are mentally unique in some way that is just not clear from our perspective, but actually it's common elsewhere. For another example, I often think about how it's pretty clear that other animals around us, many other animals, don't have as much of a capacity to sort of like logically calculate a situation as we do. But for a lot of them, it's like, well, what if they were taught the way we were? And what if they have kind of some other mental capacity that's just unclear because we can't communicate with them? Like they actually are psychic, but we just don't know. Like, how would we find that out, And then in like 50 years, we'll get radiography technology that lets us detect their brainwaves or something. And it turns out dolphins are psychic or we're psychic. I had a philosophy class where someone said, do you have any responses to "I think, therefore I am"? And I said, maybe our thoughts that seem to spring into our minds come from other people. Maybe we do have a kind of thought weft between us as humans. And the reason we come up with similar ideas isn't because they logically follow so much. I think that is why. But maybe it's because we're actually sharing thoughts in a way that is just hard to appreciate. I doubt it, but it's possible. I was saying, we don't really know for sure that's not happening. You could argue that we do. I was just presenting what you have to assume to undermine that idea. But anyway, yeah, pretty interesting. I'm interested in this kind of psionics approach. That's an interesting assumption to me. And the endurance part. Yeah, so this is a thing where, I don't know, I feel like people are just durable, and humans are, I feel like your adaptable jack of all trades became intelligent civilization race, which I've been arguing for this parlay, isn't uncommon. I feel like that type of creature probably just universally isn't very durable. You just wouldn't expect them to be like particularly tanky. There is always a question for me about, fantasy races. Like, why are these elephant people like the same as humans except they're elephants? You know what I mean? Like, wouldn't that adaptation allow them to thrive without some other stuff that we humans have? So there's a question there of like, would there be a selection pressure that would make them like as humany as humans, but then also they're just elephants and they're very durable? Like, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, you see what I'm saying? So that's weird to me. I just don't think of humans as being very durable, but I guess there is this sort of glorious, like, you lost a leg, but you keep fighting. That is a common, and it can be kind of a fun trope. And this brings me to what I think is one of the most interesting interpretations of human, which is mental plasticity. This idea that humans are able to sort of rewire a little bit and learn to continue doing the thing even though they've been gravely injured or something. This is my little fourth suggestion. So rather than kind of jack of all trades or group thinky or the apex of something, or again, sort of just coincidentally or by the numbers, somebody has to be immune to mind reading or whatever. My thing I think is interesting is the idea that human brains, or the brains we have in this world, happen to have developed in a way that is special somehow. As we know, evolution means that things develop kind of haphazardly. And that means that brains, do their job in a very complicated, sort of currently rather unknown way. But one thing we know about our brains and brains in general is they're pretty elastic. You can kind of destroy part of them or part of us, and our brain has a remarkable quality to adapt and sort of form new pathways and allow us to do this new thing. There are even parts of our physiology and our physicality that we can take control of, that it's not entirely clear like how or why we can take control of those things. But, some people can do physical things, can learn to do physical things that other people just can't do. And that sort of plasticity may be remarkable, again, kind of by accident. It might be that other brains of other intelligent civilizations kind of developed in a different way that has many advantages, but just doesn't happen to have that same level of plasticity. That could be very interesting. Another version of this trope that I like is, especially with sci-fi technology, is that because of some nominally unique thing about humans, we've kind of developed a certain technology that wouldn't really make sense for other civilizations, and that has surprising outcomes. For example, I bet a lot of intelligent civilizations research cancer, how to cure cancer. I think as you get older and you extend age more, it's only natural that, like, if you have cells, you will probably get cancer and you'll probably want to cure that cancer. And even if they don't have cancer, maybe they have, some equivalent thing where their body breaks down over time. Maybe humans have a seemingly innocuous uniqueness, like we have a few more organs than is normal that are just kind of extraneous. Like we can lose a kidney. We can, there's some research about the gallbladder being useful, or the pancreas. I mean, the appendix. Forget those gallbladder and pancreas. The appendix, I meant, being useful. But we can live without a few things, right? Some liver. Maybe that's actually kind of uncommon. On its own, that might not be that significant, but what does it do to the development of medical technology if there's this side branch, seemingly unrelated, that is about researching swapping around organs and transplanting blood and stuff? Maybe that makes more sense for humans than other civilizations, and that gently, slowly over time butterfly affects our medical technology to just be different, to end up at a very different place. Maybe approaching medical technology and research that way, with this focus on transfusion and organs and stuff, just happens to be like a very effective approach intellectually to getting to, good medical breakthroughs in aging and stuff. Maybe it just happens to be that is a good way to start it out, and because humans have that quality, we just happen to have kind of gone in that direction. In short, I think you can tell where I land on this topic overall. I don't think humans are special in the slightest, and I actually dislike the idea that they are. I think this was really interesting to discuss because it's a way for me to compare my own relative contempt for humanity with other people who are trying to write about humanity being great, and me grappling with, like, why do I not like these things, because they don't make sense to me, is basically my response. But I don't think they're like not fun or something. They can still be really cool. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of stories I've watched that display many of these same qualities that I really enjoyed. I'm not trying to say your fun is wrong or something, but personally, I like the idea that I find it really interesting how consciousness or this sort of presence of mind, whatever it is that we all have, might be very similar between other living things. And in fact, that is something very, very ununique about us, very samey. We will see that in other creatures we meet, perhaps. I don't know. That idea interests me. But it also interests me to think about, what about the very nature of the fact that we kind of came up in a similar way to other intelligent civilizations could still allow for some uniqueness. We'll still be different, and those differences could be more or less extreme. It's really interesting to think about what they might be. What is remarkable? I'm sure there is something remarkable about us. It's pretty unlikely that we're just a whatever life form, or that any life form is a whatever life form. It was a bit of a struggle to get to this point, right? From, on the grand time scale of Earth, humans continuing to not be dead and developing society wasn't the greatest time. Like, it was mostly pretty terrible for like 99% of humanity for like 99% of our history. So it's arguably still terrible now for almost all of us. So yeah, like, we're probably not so ununique. Don't get me wrong. But I do kind of feel like it's hard not to be to hold contempt for how humans have tribalized so much, and it's hard not to think that you're not telling me other species out there are even worse than us about that, right? Because that's terrifying. Like, that is very scary. But I don't know. I kind of feel like they probably are. So maybe there's something unique about that. I don't know. It's hard to say. Really interesting topic to me. I hope you can tell. But most of what I have to say about it is that I kind of want some incidental or more natural way that humans are special, rather than these ways, which I feel are kind of a quality of, intelligent civilizations in general. It seems like we would have these qualities for the reasons that we became an organized society. So why wouldn't other organized societies also have similar-ish qualities? Maybe there's some like other clear way to become an organized society. It's possible that maybe species just became so dominant. Going back to my elephant example, elephants are smart in our world. Maybe there's these elephant people, and their way of becoming dominant is that they were just so much better. They were such a perfect storm of adaptations that it led them to dominate and have free time to just sort of develop their intelligence. But I feel like elephants are arguably that way in our world, and it didn't necessarily happen for them, right? There's an argument evolutionarily that our relative weakness, our lack of specialization, is why we became so intelligent from a natural selection perspective. I'm no biologist, but it's just a thought. You tell me if that's correct, or if we even know. So yeah, anyway, just really interesting to me. I've mentioned D&D a few times, but it's a place where I think that this is even more fascinating. What about a different race, in a world with several intelligent species that are building these civilizations? What about a certain race's qualities, their lifespan, their size, their number of limbs, I don't know, their ability or not to breathe water? How does that affect them when there are other species that have different combinations of those traits? I think we can agree that in D&D, the races you can play as are all relatively jack-of-all-tradesy, relatively, durable, in the face of adversity, compared to the other creatures in the monster manual in D&D. But that doesn't mean that they're not specialized. Like, sure, if you take dwarves, elves, and humans, they're all relatively jack-of-all-tradesy compared to the other life forms. But compare elves to dwarves, maybe elves are a little more versatile, or dwarves are a little more versatile. Maybe outside the context of elves, dwarves would be really dominant on their own, but elves are able to fill a niche that dwarves don't. And so in the context of elves and dwarves existing, they're different. This is kind of what I was saying about the Type B story, where humans are the apex of something in the galaxy, where there being a bunch of other jack-of-all-tradesy but still specialized in some subtle ways species. In the context of all of those, humans happen to be special in some way. Anyway, personally, I think the idea that humans are just the jack-of-all-tradesiest and the most ambitious is really boring, and I'm much more interested in maybe humans have different sexuality than other races. Humans have these physical urges, or their hormones perform in ways that lead to different behavior. Maybe humans are more aggressive, sure. Ambitious is one that I just knocked, but I've heard that one a good amount. D&D uses that one. Humans are defined a little bit by being more ambitious than other races. That's interesting to me. Another thing to think about is I mentioned lifespan earlier. If you're surrounded by dwarves and elves and halflings or whatever, gnomes, that are living a long time compared to you, what does that do? Maybe it means you kind of build something greater generation on generation, or you feel a need to rush, and the relative relaxed nature of the life of an elf or a dwarf, because they have more time, actually lends themselves to being lazy. Like, they end up living a life where they don't have any carrot to get things done quickly, so they don't get as much done. Whereas humans are just short-lived enough that it feels like they have to rush, gives them a little push, but not so short-lived that they just don't have enough time to achieve some larger project, right? Interesting, I think. If you'll humor me, actually, about D&D races, the Kenku are a race that I've really liked thinking about for a long time from a world building perspective. The Kenku are a race in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition that basically they're like parrots, I guess. They learn sounds from what they hear, so they can't really speak on their own. They have to mimic the things they've heard to kind of build a syllabary that way. A very common discussion topic in D&D is whether or not Kenku would speak in this kind of stilted way, or maybe that way of learning speech actually doesn't really change anything. Like, they learn enough bits and pieces from the races speaking around them that they end up having a relatively normal, collection of verbisms, and they can speak pretty freely because they've absorbed enough through cultural osmosis, And I think that it depends where they live. If they live on their own, well, I don't know. They might all be speaking in beast noises of the animals they eat nearby. Maybe to them it forms a language, but one that is unknowable to anybody else. On the other hand, maybe Kenku raised around a very mixed trade city with all sorts of people there end up speaking pretty normally by age 2, or maybe they even speak even better than other species do because they naturally evolved to have this incredible memory for speech. Maybe they use verbisms a little funny, they use the word colloquially in a way that doesn't totally make sense, but they have a very good vocabulary and they're quite good at catching on and learning new things. I'm imagining that would make Kenku, while relatively short-lived, maybe much faster learners than a lot of their peers. And how does that affect their relatively short lifespan compared to a bunch of other, intelligent species with their own civilizations? So I don't know. I find this really interesting. This kind of like, set a few parameters and see what that does to the world is a very popular piece of world building advice, but that's an example of the way I like it. I really like this stuff. I'm not a person where I need my immersion to not be broken. I can get behind stories like the ones we've been talking about where humanity has this quality and we're just in this world where they're super durable and they can take these crazy hits and all this wonky stuff happens to them and they're still there. I could get behind that. I get the fun there. I'm a person who that doesn't ruin a story for me as long as there's other stuff I'm enjoying. But at the same time, I do really like it when there's this sort of like, this is why this is this way. It's natural that this would be this way. I'll give you a quick example and that'll be the end. I'm working on starting a D&D campaign where I'm going to DM and it's my own world. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how a lot of the D&D community, they don't like playing at high levels, or campaigns don't go to higher levels, either because the group doesn't stay together that long, or because it's more work for the DM as you get to higher levels. Your party members start being able to cast spells that take them to a different plane of existence in one action, and then 6 seconds later, they're on the elemental plane of fire, and you, the DM, have to come up with that now, it's a lot. That's just a simple example, but there are loads. What does it do if one of the players begins making clones and now they're basically just unkillable and they're always going to be unkillable? Does another creature try to track down their little clone nest or what happens. And I think it's clear to see if you look at the spells that you get at higher levels in D&D that you become basically immortal. Like you can't be stopped by normal non-god level means. You essentially become a deity of your own. And I think that most people who get to that point would do what people do in actual D&D. They would have a bit of fun and then retire. And they would probably leave. And they'd probably leave some things behind them. They would shape the world in some way and then leave it. In all likelihood, there would simply be no point. There wouldn't be any reason to stay there. They could trivially conquer the entire world. So why bother, you know? And for what, when they can conjure as much money and food and other pleasures as they want? There's just no point. They would leave. And so you have a world, or at least I think you'd have a world, where you don't see super powerful archmages everywhere, but you see traces of what they left behind before they fled. You can make simulacrums, you know, basically clones of yourself, snapshots of yourself that can cast Wish. Sometimes Wish makes you unable to cast it ever again, but if your simulacrum is casting it, who cares? You can then just wish for whatever you want and leave. But doesn't that mean that you leave behind a bunch of ultra powerful directionless simulacrums in like a cave somewhere? I think it does mean that. And I think that means that sometimes you end up on a massive treasure hunt to go find some absurdly powerful but useless to the person who made them treasure. It's totally One Piece. I understand that. That's what I think the plot of what, not a spoiler for One Piece. I don't know. I'm just saying, if you know anything about the premise of One Piece, that's totally what the One Piece is. I'm telling you. And I think that would be the case in a lot of D&D worlds too. That would just be sort of one of the default outcomes. Got a world you want to build that's very skewed? Well, maybe your world had people that became very powerful and didn't just retire and go away. They did conquer the whole world and they made it very extreme in some way. I really like this. I feel like it elegantly makes pretty much any D&D setting feel like it was potentially the natural consequence of things that just would happen, just would believably happen. You don't have to make them happen. There's no special event. It's just kind of the nature of intelligent beings that are conscious and have all this magic that it kind of would end up that way, I think. I don't know. I think it's interesting. There's a whole question about where does that leave martial combatants? You know, you have characters like the monk that kind of ascend to a sort of demigod level physical endurance. They stop aging, they're ultra powerful, but they don't have this kind of world shaping strength. Does that mean you're going to encounter a lot of meditating on a mountain retreat physical characters? Maybe there's relatively more physical paragons left behind because they're not as powerful at that highest level, because they're not this world-shaping force. Or maybe you still don't find a lot of them because they end up being the spouse or eternity buddy for one of these super powerful magic characters. This magicking character who shapes the world has their little party of adventurers that they grew to power with, and they end up taking them with them. Who knows? You know, maybe, maybe not. I just think that's really interesting. And so this general topic, I hope you can tell, I said a lot of negative things about how I didn't really like these premises that much, but it is really, really interesting to me. So I hope you had a good time too. I hope that was an interesting way to hear about how I think about them. But yeah, there you go. Thanks for asking. A really interesting, unexpected, I think quite complicated question as well, that I hope I did some justice to and talked about in a way you enjoyed.